Hello there, Christopher. How are you doing?
Well, hey, folks. Good evening. Hey, Ron. Good to see you again, as always. Welcome, everybody.
That's right. And it's Monday, which means only one thing. It's time for Monday Night Monsters.
Monday Night Monsters and part two of
Uh,
our in depth deep dive exploration into the origins of the folklore and legends of vampires.
yes, indeed. So I would say that last week would be Monday Night Monsters' first official cliffhanger.
Yeah, it definitely was. We didn't
Yes.
even know if we were going to make it through the show that evening because we had a lot of material to cover, and we finally wisely decided just a little before we went on the air that we were going to try to split it into two parts. And so last week, basically, hopefully you were on board with us. What we got through mostly was the era of antiquity when blood gods and these vampiric creatures in the spirit world had begun to sort of be introduced to the human psyche. And I think before we were done for the evening, we had just begun to get into the creatures. Hey, Mary Beth, good to have you on board there. See you there. Very much gotten into the more corporeal creatures, the beginning of what we would call a vampire in the modern context. So we're going to explore that a little more deeply, of course, tonight. Pepper, nice to see you. Looks
Yeah,
like we
it's
got
going
a
to be
few
fun.
people checking in with us tonight.
Yeah, when we were going over this last week before the show, we said, we've got a pretty vast time period to cover here, but surely we can get through 45,000 years of human history in an hour. No worries.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
vampires.
it's a no-brainer.
That's right. But if I'm not mistaken, I believe that our cliffhanger ended with us hanging on just by a thread at around 1000 BC, if I'm not mistaken.
It was right in that neighborhood, absolutely. Of course,
Yes.
we haven't quite jumped into the modern era yet, but what we were exploring really is the origin of how what we today consider a classic vampire came to exist within the human consciousness and human psyche. Because as much as fiction seems to lean us in the direction of believing this, vampires didn't start out the way we see them today. Vampires had a long evolution through many different sort of grander cosmic entities, through smaller spirits, demons, and creatures of all sorts. And so tonight we're going to, again, look a little more deeply into where they jumped off of the spectral realm and actually became the corporeal vampires that we all know and love today. Know and love, or know and fear, depending on your perspective.
I've got my steak and garlic ready, so I say we head on in.
I always keep garlic around. I'm half Italian, so very good. All right. So as I say, we're going to kind of jump, I think, right into this. Last week, I think the last creatures specifically we spoke about were the Impusa, and there was one other, and actually I can't remember even what the creatures were, but a couple of these these female, very deadly, sort of life-sucking creatures that were part of old Greek folklore. And the Greeks had a lot of creatures that were vampiric, that lived either by drinking the blood, or in many cases, and this is where a lot of early vampire folklore came from actually drawing out the very life force from their victims. And they were just beginning to take on a more human form, although certainly not all human. And here's one that I know that you're familiar with, and a kind of a horrifying creature, and one that I actually first encountered as a young nerd in role-playing games, is the Strix. These Strix, or sometimes called Styurges, are these almost mosquito-like birds, but they have some bat-like qualities to them, these long proboscis, and obviously they're inspired by things like mosquitoes and other parasites. But the ancient Greeks believed these things lurked in caves or dark places and would fly out by night, capture people, and of course drink up their blood. And the sort of thing that certainly would have inspired fears of, again, the vampire creatures that would fly through the night. Now, I know you had included these in one of your presentations. Ron and I, at the beginning of each of these weeks when we're starting these programs, we kind of trade some of our own information back and forth so we can kind of build a program for you. And so I'd love to hear your perspective on these strange creatures.
Well, I think that what you had said is they have this combination of insect and also like a bird type of quality. And I think that hits very close to home because the Strix was actually a word that was used to pertain to Lilith. In various resources. If you look at the Judaic context, and if Lilith is indeed mentioned within the book of Deuteronomy, like some scholars suggest, then she is simply referred to as a Strix. Her humanity, or what was left of it, has been stripped down. and now she is nothing more than a wild bird that exists in the wastelands where people bury their dead, and where those people who have diseases, go out and spend the rest of their years out in the wasteland. The Strix is also the scientific name for the owl as well. So you have this kind of inclusion now, and this is where we see the idea of the vampire becoming that creature of the night that we were talking about, right? And it's really goes back several thousand years, but by this time, within our collective consciousness as a burgeoning civilization, we see that these are the creatures of the night, and this is out of that milieu in which these kind of images are formed. That Lilith, as I've said, no longer becomes a scantily clad seductress. Now she's been converted almost entirely into a monster. And the interesting thing about the Greco-Roman tradition is they are so quick to synchronize other religions.
Very
So
much so.
we can see within their vampire mythos that appropriation of various cultures around them and their vampiric traditions as well.
By the way, before we go any farther, one thing I want to do very quickly is I want to welcome our viewers aboard. I know we've got some folks here probably tonight from Dark Zone Radio. We're really happy to have you folks aboard. We've got some viewers here tonight through Facebook and, of course, our loyal YouTube viewers. So very, very happy to have you folks aboard with us tonight. And as always, please feel free to drop your comments and questions in the comments tonight. Our usual guy in the chair, Ken, isn't with us this evening. He may be coming in later, but that may mean we're a little bit slower to respond to questions because we're not always the most on top of paying attention to what's going on the sidebar. But we will certainly try and keep our eye on there and get to any questions that we can this evening as well. I'm going to take a split second here, and I'm actually going to close my window because outside of my window right now, I have tree frogs that are I don't know if you can hear them. They're incredible loud animals, and as much as I think they're very entertaining, they're not exactly great for a podcast. So give me just a second while I send the tree frogs back where they came from.
Yes, I was wondering what that was. But make sure that those tree frogs aren't indeed some sort of vampiric creature that is transformed and simply wants to get into your home.
Well, it was kind of fun that we were listening to talking stories about these, mysterious flying creatures of the night while this bizarre chittering is happening in the background.
That's right. That's right.
But the tree frogs are going to have to wait. So
I'm glad to see that our neighbors to the north in Canada are so well represented here week after week. That's always a good thing to see.
We do. We're actually getting a really nice cross section of people from all over the place, which I love to see, even in different time zones and everything. So I'm glad that you folks choose to join us. Now, there's a vampiric creature that I've always been fascinated by, which turns up in Eastern culture. You see it in Filipino culture. You see it in Malaysian culture. And they have these vampires that I think, among others, not only are they growing even closer still to what we would ultimately see as a traditional vampire, but these are some of the most horrifying creatures in all of folklore. And from the Filipino tradition, you have the penanggalan. I'm not completely sure that I am saying that correctly, but this is certainly, I think, one of the most grotesque and horrifying vampire creatures in all of folklore. This is a woman who, cursed dead woman, whose head and innards would detach from the body. So the body would still be intact in the grave, but the head trailing the lungs, the viscera would fly forth out of the body, and it would fly through the air, trailing its tendrils. And much like we were discussing last week, and something that seems to occur time and time again in these legends, is the penanggalan would prey on children and pregnant women. And again, I think this sort of probably, maybe, we might even want to explore the idea that some of these legends may connect to the fears that people had surrounding pregnancy. The idea that the fears that women had that a child was in some way a parasitic thing, because we are a superstitious people. We are a superstitious species. And the fact that having a living creature growing within you and feeding on you has got to produce anxiety. And so the idea of fearing while pregnant, the idea of some parasitic creature actually drawing life on you, may be the sort of thing that would actually generate or at least add to legends of creatures like the Penanggalan. And I apologize, I'm saying that this one was from the Philippines. This one was from Malaysia. The Filipino version, which was quite similar, although often portrayed with wings, is the Aswang. But again, only the upper portion of the body and the lower was literally dripping with bloody viscera. So these are truly horrifying monsters that exist in these cultures. I think one of the most interesting things I'd ever heard about these creatures is that expectant mothers or women who feared that these flying nightmarish monsters might invade their homes because they wouldn't have glass in their windows. This is a very, very early period in history where your window, it was either open or it was closed. On a hot summer night, you don't want to keep your windows closed. You want fresh air in the house. And so they would take the leaves of the genu tree, which were these spiny, prickly leaves, and they would line the openings of their house with them. And the spines on this, if the Penanggalan tried to drag itself through the window, its viscera would actually become tangled in the genu leaves until sunrise, when the rising sun would vanquish the creature. So here you see even some origins of the idea of the sunlight and the vampire. Although truthfully, again, we hadn't quite gotten to the European vampire at this period in history.
Right now, is this pre-Christian contact? Would you think?
I know actually that this is a belief that still exists within the folklore of the Malaysian, the Filipino, and other Eastern cultures. How far back it goes, I don't know, but it does seem to be a comparatively ancient part of their belief system. So it may be before Christianization, especially when I know a lot of Spanish sort of colonization took place in a lot of these Eastern nations.
The one thing that you said was very pertinent, and we did not cover that on our last show, and that is the fact that almost all these societies that we're talking about, all these cultures, did not have windows. We think about nowadays, you just shut your window to keep frogs from, coming on in, the sound of the frogs from coming in. But when a place like Malaysia or the place like the Philippines, and we know that they have bats there that grow to prodigious sizes. The fruit bats there are absolutely huge. Is it possible that somewhere within their history, they did have some sort of bat, whether it be vampiric bat or not, but I'm talking about a naturally occurring bat, that it was something that was very fearful to them. So they personified into this, this creature like the Aswang that would come in. Because I think the one thing that we're not making connection with is the idea of something actually entering your house and preying upon you, something from the natural world, nothing at all paranormal related or anything. And we do know that bats, will come into people's houses, even bats that are not carnivorous bats. I've had bats in my house before as well, too. But if you would think of a traditional people, whenever a bat would come into the house, and possibly even the bite of a bat producing rabies, what that could actually do to your mentality and how you look at the world around you from that point on.
Fruit bats in the tropical and warmer regions, some of these, the flying foxes, silver-headed flying foxes, these creatures have wingspans up to 6 feet. They're enormous creatures, and people have always held superstitions about them, about the fact that they would carry diseases, about the idea that they were sort of demonic in appearance, because for so long people have associated, cultures all over the world have associated bat wings with things of the underworld and things that were demonic. And so certainly the idea, especially since almost all of these animals fly by night, even fruit bats, which do have good vision and don't feed on insects, still are very, very active at night. The idea that it would be a terrifying sight to see these things flying overhead, and certainly it would inspire nightmarish ideas, especially, as I say, being very superstitious as a species, and humans certainly are.
Yeah. Now take that then by within a context of you're a parent and you wake up and you see one of these things standing beside your child's crib with its wings spread open in front of the window. See, that stuff is the stuff of nightmares at that point.
I would imagine so. As I say, so what we're doing now is slowly we're seeing how these creatures, these etheric and these spiritual creatures, were slowly sort of coming together and becoming more physical things people could see, people could actually experience or somehow interact with in the real world. And so they became much less nebulous concepts, and slowly but surely began to become the predecessors, the sort of ancestors of what would eventually become a vampire. And by the way, it's worth noting that at this point in history, the word vampire vampire didn't even exist yet. So we're now talking about sort of the pre-existence of the traditional vampire. Creatures that were vampiric the way we understand it today, certainly all throughout folklore, but the Slavic word vampire that would come to define these creatures hadn't even really been coined at that time. But it was right around this period in history where the idea of something that we talked a little bit about a couple of weeks ago when we did our zombie episode is the idea of another thing that was a common fear among people, is the idea of the returning dead, the revenant. The revenant meaning specifically a corpse that comes back from the grave. And this has been something that's been present in human folklore for a very long time at this point. And even some vampiric aspects present in the Revenant legend, not just the idea of the walking corpse, but there has always been a fear in humans that because death often looked unpleasant, and we've distrusted the idea of death, even though it's natural, even though it happens to everyone, and we've been seeing it with every single person and every animal and everything that surrounds us. Death has been a part of life since the beginning of history, and yet it's always been fearful to us. And one of the things that has always been fearful about death is that we don't know if the dead continue to have some kind of life after death. And people tend to worry that the dead might be vengeful because nobody wants to be dead. So are the dead themselves angry about it? If they're angry about it and they want to do us harm, that makes us fearful of the dead themselves. Not fearful of death, but fearful of the dead. And this is certainly where the earliest revenant beliefs would come from. And these are the things that were the building blocks that would eventually come together to be the traditional vampire. Now,
yeah, we have famous treatises on these creatures, especially in the Middle Ages. I believe it's William of Newburgh. I believe is the one religious gentleman that would write about various things, write about various aspects of town life and courtly behaviors and things. But every now and then he would throw in a little snippet, a little vignette of something horrific. It would be kind of like something off of the X-Files or something. He'd be writing about something happening in town, and all of a sudden you have a revenant involved. And it was very interesting whenever he described how these things operate. And it was very matter of fact about how he described them as well, too. He talked about dogs chasing down the corpses that walk through the street, something very natural. But these creatures, these revenants, often went back to their place of where they were living. And it's very interesting to see how these creatures are definitely separated from what we understand as from the vampire. But it is also at this time whenever the Catholic Church takes hold, right? Because one of the ways to get rid of a revenant is by having a priest intercede for you, some sort of exorcism that goes on, some sort of cleansing that has to go on. So it's from this time, very early in the Middle Ages, that we see the idea of faith being able to dispel these creatures. And that's the first time we see that because now we have good and evil as part of the vernacular of these creatures.
Very much so, and this is something that will become a huge part of vampire folklore moving forward. But as of yet, the vampire rules hadn't been established, and this was going to take centuries before we really crystallized the vampires into the way we understand them today. And at this point, every culture had a different perspective, but the European culture specifically did start to really bring Christianity and the idea of that vampires were often, or rather revenants and these other resurrected dead were believed to be victims of possession in some way, that they were possessed by an unclean spirit, or that the soul, for instance, having itself been a wicked soul, couldn't move on, and so some aspect of it remained behind and animated the body. Also believing that that a dead body was incredibly susceptible to being inhabited by wandering spirits. This is the reason that a lot of the folk traditions of people like the Jewish people, who would make sure that mirrors were covered and everything, so that the soul of the dead person didn't get trapped in a mirror. There were all of these different folk tales that kind of wound up into the idea of the potential susceptibility of a dead body. It's often believed that even something as simple as moonlight falling on a corpse or a cat leaping over a body could actually imbue it with a demonic spirit. In fact, I believe it's the Japanese have a very vampiric creature that is called a Shangxi or a Guangxi. And this creature, again, it's begins as a human being, but if moonlight accidentally, a single ray of moonlight falls upon the corpse, it is possessed by this demonic, hungry entity and spouts green fur. So they don't look like what we would consider a traditional vampire, but it spouts green fur, rises from the dead, and then hunts based on and I think this has got to be based on some natural phenomena, actually hunts based on smelling for your breath. They
Yeah.
entirely hunt based on the smell of your breath. And what's interesting about that to me is that this is how mosquitoes hunt. As weird as it is, mosquitoes actually sense the carbon dioxide in your breath. And I wonder if somebody somehow made this connection and it evolved into the legend of the Guangxi as a spirit form of this same kind of a predator. They say that if you are being hunted by one of these creatures, you would blow through a tube to try to redirect your breath away from yourself so that these creatures couldn't track you down.
Wow,
And
that's fascinating.
you may actually have seen, because there are some films about these Chinese and Japanese vampires that hop, and the reason that they're called the hopping vampire is because since it's dead, rigor mortis is set in, so it's not able to move freely, and so they have their arms straight out in front of them. They have to hop to move, so they're almost comical in a lot of the films that have made. They've appeared in comedies, they've appeared in horror films, in Asian culture, but the Chinese hopping vampire is a really interesting sort of a permutation on the legend.
It is. What's also interesting too is that's the way bats move, and that hopping type of motion. Especially if you would look on YouTube of a vampire bat moving, it looks like a very small, awkward person walking through your room or whatever.
They are surprisingly
Again,
nimble on their little elbows, though. I'll say that.
that's right. That's right. But getting back to the idea of the fear of death as well. Not only are we still see the idea of the fear of death, the fear of the other side, but what causes death as well too. That the idea that a corpse, somebody that is dead, could still breed contagion within the world of the living, I think is also inherent within these stories as well.
Plague fears were a
Yeah.
big part of vampire folk belief. And actually, kind of to jump back on something that you said, and even though it wasn't your meaning, you gave me a little bit of a trigger here when you said the idea that vampires could breed disease. Well, there was the other idea that the vampires could simply breed. One of the earliest fears that was present in the revenant belief, and that absolutely carried over into early vampire belief, is that the dead, when they return, come back with the same hungers and lusts they had when they were alive. And so many of these early stories about these resurrected corpses and revenants would be that they would return to their home looking to lay with their wives and lay with their partners, and actually would have children. And there are a lot of horror stories connected to that and what the children of these revenants were. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense in a from a biological perspective, but it also led to other creatures that were sort of half of vampire creatures that turned up in later folklore. And we'll talk a little bit about those later on. But I want to talk about sort of the leap when it really started to become the closest to what we now consider a vampire. And I think one of the earliest of these that I've read about is a German legend of the Nachzehrer. The Nachzehrer means literally the night chewer, which is such a bizarre and sort of horrifying idea. But the idea of the Nachzehrer is that when a corpse is buried, if it remains awake, if it remains either possessed or becomes possessed or remains aware of itself, that it would literally chew through its own burial shroud, chew through the dirt, and chew its way out of its grave. And then, of course, rising from its grave would then go in search of these earthly hungers. And so they wouldn't necessarily be looking for blood, but they would be looking to return to their home, to be fed, to make love to their wives, etc., and to try to resume their mortal life. But of course, they're not returning as as an attractive version of themselves. They're returning to their homes as these hideous, rotting corpses, and so very zombie-like, but with a degree of sentience and believing that they can return to their normal life. So one of the traditions that arose did follow itself into vampire belief was the idea that you turned the corpse face down in the grave. So when the Nachzehrer or the revenant woke up, it would chew downward into the earth instead of chewing up out of the grave.
Yeah,
Dreadful.
very interesting. Yeah, yeah. There was one thing that I was whenever I was doing writing my book on this, and I covered this particular chapter. A lot of scholars suggested that the idea comes from disinterring a corpse and finding that it was actually chewing on a shroud. Somebody was buried alive, and that's what happened. I'm sure that happened a good bit of the time. But now we also have the idea of the fear of not only death, but the fear of being buried alive comes into play as well.
This is something that was almost an epidemic fear in the Victorian era, when certain diseases like cholera, consumption could bring your body to the brink of death, and put you in a coma-like state, but that you might actually come back from. And certainly, Victorian novelists like Edgar Allan Poe, early Victorian novelists like Edgar Allan Poe, wrote a great deal about that because he had a absolutely paralyzing fear of being buried alive, and that subject turns up in the House of Usher. It turns back up in Ligeia, Berenice, and so many of his other stories. Now, I think when people think of vampires, I think people have a tendency to think of Romania, Transylvania, and everything. That's very much where we think of traditional vampires as coming from, and they're not too far off, because I would say that the Western conception of what we think of as a vampire certainly comes very much from the Transylvanian and Romanian ideas, and they came up with this fascinating idea. They had this dichotomy in their vampires. There were basically two forms of a vampire. There were the living vampires, and there were the undead vampires. A living vampire, the moroi, was a person who was cursed and tainted, and while they would have these vampiric attributes in life, they were generally evil or wicked people, and they were fated to become a true vampire, an undead vampire, or strigoi, after death. But if you could identify the moroi, they could be potentially exorcised and have that vampire spirit cleansed from them. But I think this brings us as close as we've been so far to the very traditional vampire. Now, of course, the word vampire does not come from Romania. It is a Slavic word. The Romanian language is a Romance language, but the strigoi and moroi, I think, is where we have finally reached what we would consider to be the modern cultural vampire, the creature that we have come to recognize. And really, the way vampires tend to be portrayed in cinema and on television is much more often these very human-like vampires, which would be, I think, what the Romanian folklore would call the moroi, these living vampires who had not really transformed into the more Nosferatu-like undead creatures.
Right. So if we would go back in time and we would interview Vlad the Impaler, this is what would come to his mind when we would talk about the vampire, the undead. Now, it's interesting about the Strigoi because there are other ways, of course, to become the Strigoi. And it also has a lot to deal with the Catholic faith as well, too. An unbaptized baby, you could become a Strigoi. If you were cursed by a witch, if you have red hair, that could also be a sign that you're a Strigoi as well, too. So it was one of those things where it was within the environment. It
Yes.
was something to keep your eyes open for. It was like a warning to you that these things could exist out there. So it was kind of like a rallying cry for people to, basically be wary of the world around them.
There's another word that's common in Romania, which is the vukodlak. The vukodlak being a cursed birth, a cursed person who may become a werewolf, who may become a vampire. This could be because they were born with red hair. It might mean that they were born with teeth. If a
Mhm.
child is born and already has teeth, or born with the cowl still over their
Mhm.
head. All of these were reasons to believe that you were cursed to become some kind of a supernatural creature. And the vukodlak in life basically would often have werewolf-like attributes. And this is something that I've always found fascinating. In a lot of old folklore, a wizard or witch was fated to become a vampire, but also if you were a werewolf in life, you would become a vampire after death. And we've often talked about the fact that these legends do not always have distinctive little boxes the way we see them today. A werewolf isn't just a werewolf, a witch isn't just a witch, etc. That they often have all of these overlaps, and that the words that describe them often have overlaps as well. I've often thought it was interesting. We were talking about the Strix or Steerges earlier, that how it is to words like strigoi, and even strega, the Italian word for witch, that these all have this sort of root, and that since there are Romance languages that are all kind of crossing over here, wondering if there is a root between all of these things that gives them a little bit more commonality.
Oh, there
But
definitely is. Oh, without a doubt, yes.
but there's the one word, of course, that we haven't really addressed yet, which is where specifically the word vampire came from and where it entered the language. And vampire actually comes from the Slavic upir, and it literally means blood drinker. And this is the first time in folklore when these creatures were specifically identified not merely as resurrected, not even merely as life consuming, but actually creatures in search of your blood. And this is definitely something that was part of the Romanian and Transylvanian folkloric belief. In fact, it was believed that the strigoi, they didn't have fangs the way we see them in movies. They had a stinger on the end of their tongue, and basically this snake-like stinger would come out of their mouth and actually pierce you, not generally in the neck, although certainly there are some vampire lore that involves the neck, but actually usually right over the heart to go directly to the source of your blood. And I think this is where we have finally actually found the vampire the way we understand it today. Maybe visibly or physically not exactly the way we see them in modern cinema, but we've now got these resurrected corpses actually out in search of blood. And so it's been a long road to get to them, but I think we've actually finally reached these creatures.
It only took 1,400 years. So,
Give or take, give or take.
Yeah, we're about 1,400 AD right now. So it took that long of a period of time. So
it would have been faster if there was internet back then, but I hear the reception was terrible.
That's exactly right. But I always found it fascinating that the idea of it feeding directly over your heart, or sometimes even between your eyes. I'm not sure if you ever heard that as well.
I haven't
Too.
heard that one, but
Yeah,
that's
the
pretty
idea, the way it
repulsive.
feeds is different. Yeah, that's right.
A couple of really interesting incidents happened, and we've jumped forward in time quite a bit right now because now we're well into the ADs now, and you had vampire belief that existed in the Middle Ages, but again, this is where we're starting to evolve through disease and the ideas of revenants and everything. It really wasn't until the 16 and into the 1700s that these much more modern conceptions of vampires became fairly crystallized in culture, and certainly when the word vampire started to be introduced into the language. And two very specific incidents, both from Serbia, kind of changed the playing field quite a bit. And this was the case of two men. One of them was a soldier by the name of Peter Blagojevich in Serbia in 1726, who came back, was killed in battle. He was a perfectly upstanding member of his community, or thought to be an upstanding member of his community. Went to war, was killed in battle, brought back to his hometown and buried. And within just a few days after he was buried, people in the town started noticing that he was wandering the streets by night. And he was wearing shabby clothing and certainly looking worse for wear, but they clearly recognized him, and that he would seem almost lost wandering around the town. But at this point, his wife reported that he was returning to the house every night. And again, as we were discussing earlier, looking for his husbandly due. And that this was considered obviously to be a terrible blasphemy, and it was reported to the authorities. And the authorities, actually, this is all records. This isn't folklore anymore. Now we're talking about actual piece of history. The authorities went to the graveyard, dug up Peter Blagojevich, and I believe they burned his body in the belief that he was a vampire. But what's interesting about this is that this was only the beginning in that village, and that from there on out, other people in the graveyard actually started getting up and wandering around at night, and it became something of a vampire epidemic. And what is fascinating about this is that not only do we have some very, very distinctive vampire sort of lore superimposing over this, but this is from the historical record, and these things really happened on some level. I'm not trying to suggest that this was a real vampire. Obviously, this could be some sort of natural phenomena, even if it was just somebody who was, in a comatose state or something, but a piece of the historical record. And one of the first true vampire accounts from history that actually led to the vampire panic that actually started to spread across Europe during the 15th century, 16th century, and so on, and became honestly epidemic in much the same way that some of the plagues that were overrunning these places did. And shortly after Peter Blagojevich was another man named Arnaud Payol. And, oh, I'm sorry, I apologize. This was actually a little bit before. I'm sorry, the last one was 1736. 1731, a few years earlier, Arnaud Payol, also in Serbia, a very similar story. And the strangest part about this one, and I've always thought this is a really funny detail, is that when Arnaud Payol also returned to his home, he went to get his shoes. I have no idea why that is such a bizarre piece, but this is a really curious little aspect of the story, is that he actually showed up at his home, dead, a rotting corpse, asking for his shoes. So make of that what you will, but apparently vampires don't feel comfortable walking around without a fresh pair of shoes on.
Well,
But
and
these
shoes are expensive, Chris.
yeah, but these
Yeah.
two stories, I really, and this is some of the first time that the word vampire, in its modern form, actually appeared in official documents. And it didn't end there, because in the aftermath of this, other European villages, not just in Serbia, in Silesia, Moravia, spreading out through the Germanic world, and then eventually beyond that, actually began to fear vampires were infesting their graveyards and responsible for spates of deaths that were happening in these communities.
We have to keep in mind this is the Enlightenment. This is whenever the idea that God is now, the idea that God was in all the details. This is the age of humanism. This is the age whenever, man as kind of the paramount of creation now, and we're still dealing with vampires. To put things in perspective, I went to the University of Pittsburgh, and the University of Pittsburgh was founded in 1787. So we're talking 50 years after this time. So this is a very modern world that we're delving into. This is the time whenever the French and Indian War will be going on fairly soon. George Washington is going to be earning his medal as the general for whenever he would become president. All this stuff is going within this particular time period. And it really, as a historian, it boggles the mind to think that all this stuff is going around the world and people are still hunting vampires.
In fact, throughout that era, because the vampire panic grew and grew, there were various methods that began to be developed. As I say, we know what we didn't have a rule book at that point. There was no great book of vampires where you could look up how do I dispatch a vampire.
Yeah.
So people used all sorts of complicated or sometimes simple but seemingly logical means to destroy vampires. Two of the methods that turned up, and these are real photos from actual graves that were discovered, were placing a brick or stone between the teeth of a suspected corpse that was believed to be a vampire to keep it from chewing its way out of the grave. Another in this, the second photo here, is to take the skull, decapitate it, and put it between the legs, because the vampire then basically wouldn't be able to get up because it didn't have its head. That seems like a logical thing to do. Beheading vampires actually would end up becoming a fairly common method of dispatching them. And even the classic, the one that we are all so familiar with, which wasn't really in practice yet, but would come into practice soon, the stake through the heart thing, was never actually the stake through the heart. It wasn't about driving the stake through the heart. It was about driving a stake through the body and into the ground below to pin the vampire to keep it from getting up out of its grave. And these things all began to show up, especially again in the 18th century and even still to some degree in the 19th century. But what happened in the 19th century changed the game forever. And this was the introduction of the vampire into fiction. We have now, of course, we have seen what people thought about what vampires were, but in, I think it was 1819, which coincidentally was the very same year that Frankenstein was published. One of the companions that was there with Mary Shelley in Geneva when she conceived of Frankenstein was a young doctor by the name of William Polidori. And Polidori, rather dubiously, stole a fragment of a story from the poet Lord Byron that had this idea of an immortal life-drinking nobleman, and he expanded upon it, would end up publishing it as The Vampire in 1819. And interestingly enough, when The Vampire was first published in 1819, it was credited to Lord Byron, but it was eventually revealed that it was written by his physician, John Polidori. And it is the first true English vampire story. Now, the thing about this that is fascinating, it's also the story that established the aristocratic vampire. There had been no such thing before. Vampires were hideous, monstrous walking corpses, these predatory creatures. The idea of the sophisticated aristocrat that could actually pass in polite society was actually originated in Polidori's Victorian novel, very early Victorian novel. I guess technically that's just before the beginning of the Victorian age, but we kind of lump it in there.
Yeah, this is the age of romanticism, right? And
Exactly.
it's also a social commentary too, I think, because we're dealing with class struggle here as well. And now we have a aristocrat feeding off the other layers of society.
Yes, and an aristocrat who basically consumes young girls and throws them away, which was something that Polidori was making a comment almost specifically on Lord Byron, who he
Absolutely.
considered to be,
Yeah.
a man of dissolute morals and also a jilted lover, because Polidori and Byron were said to have been lovers, and he was not only felt heartbroken that Byron didn't choose him, but then would actually have to watch him basically chew through these young women and discard them, and so he wrote this scathing story based, I'm sure, with a great deal of relish on Byron's own fragment that lampooned Byron himself.
Right. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe that there's an anecdotal tell about Byron taking Shelley or his wife's, well, before it was his wife's maidenhead, if you will, over a grave in a graveyard someplace. Have you ever heard of that
I
story?
have indeed heard that, yes, and
Yes.
again, there's a lot of very dark stories. I think Byron was officially the very first Goth,
I
so
think so
you
as
got to
well.
give him a lot of credit for sort of setting the stage for the vampire aesthetic that would end up following them for the next century and a half. Um,
Yes.
and right about that point in history, again, just the dawn of the Victorian age, the other thing that was happening were the introduction of the penny dreadful. Penny dreadfuls being these little cheap 1 penny at a time, which is exactly how they earned that name, 1 penny at a time chapters of often very garish and gruesome stories. They were murder stories, they were detective stories, and one of the most famous was the story Varney the Vampire, which ended up being like 800 pages before it was all said and done. So quite a tome of a book, but you could read it one chapter at a time, and each one was guaranteed to have some gruesome scene of vampiric mischief or some terrible occult ritual, and almost always had a cliffhanger. It was kind of the early movie serials, the early predecessor to the movie serial. But the vampire had now launched itself into the public imagination. Varney the Vampire was pretty darn popular, and now vampires started to turn up in the burgeoning horror fiction that became so popular throughout the Gothic era. And just a handful of years before the most famous vampire novel was published, one that really sort of, again, set the stage was J. Sheridan Le Fanu's 1872 novella, really, Carmilla. This one had a female vampire. We discussed a lot earlier the fact that female vampires were a huge part of the early folklore, but in the early Victorian Gothic folklore, the vampires tended to be these predatory aristocrats. And Carmilla, again, kind of reset the stage on that. Now you had this female aristocrat, again, consuming women. It had a lot of aspects of lesbianism. It was considered quite scandalous at the time, but it also established a lot of the precedent that would go on to show up in vampire folklore, including the stake through the heart idea was introduced in Carmilla, and so much of this, the shape-shifting vampire, she turned into a cat or often would appear as a cat, was something that really hadn't been seen in the fiction yet at that point, and it almost set the pattern that Bram Stoker would shortly thereafter follow in writing the novel Dracula, which would of course go on to become the most famous vampire novel ever written.
And there's also that intimacy there as well too. The idea, especially with the neck, the idea of feeding off of somebody, getting that close to somebody, there is definitely that intimacy there. And by the time we get to Stoker and we get to this idea of Victorian prudishness, this was a way to kind of break down that iconoclasm, that idea that sexuality is separated from humanity in different ways. These vampires allow us to see ourselves. We are projected onto these creatures, and we see ourselves as very sexual creatures, and we see the idea of what sex can do outside of marriage and everything else. So these are one of the reasons that I like to study the vampiric tradition within the Victorian period more than any other period, because they are making social commentary on what's going on at the time as well.
Absolutely. And again, they were very sexually repressed people,
They're
but
right.
like anyone, we tend to think of the Victorians as very prudish. They were prudish on the street, But when they were behind closed doors, they had very salacious, appetites for fiction, in their sexual conquests. And of course, we have characters like Byron and Shelley, and these characters who are sort of sexual libertines, and that definitely comes out in the Victorian literature, which expresses creatures, the vampires, which among other things are sexually free creatures, which sort of force intimacy. There's a great deal of rape allegory in here, but in the fiction, it's the sort of seductive version of rape. It's the rape where you have the victim who becomes willing. So it's a dark and a very twisted version of sexuality, but it expressed a lot of the repressed Victorian attitudes.
Absolutely.
And at the time that these stories were growing in popularity, the vampire panic that had spread throughout Europe at this point, and had also introduced a lot of Christian symbology into the idea of repelling vampires with Christian symbolism, with the crucifix, with the host, and all these different things, it had somehow found its way to America as well. And here in America, for a good century, from the 1790s into the 1890s, especially here in the Northeast, vampire belief became fairly widespread. And this kind of really came to a head in 1892 when a story actually hit the newspapers. Most of these stories were small, private things that happened in small towns. But in 1892, one particular story truly took off. And that was the story of a young woman by the name of Mercy Lena Brown. Mercy Lena Brown died in January of 1892, and her family, different members of her family had died previous to her, all of the same wasting disease. The people of the town, having already had experience with what they believed were vampires, because again, it was something that was a common belief at that time, pressured Mercy's father, George Brown, to exhume her body and to check to see if she might be a vampire, because other members of the family had already died and they felt that the vampiric contagion had touched the Brown family. George Brown was very against this idea. He thought the concept was absolutely ludicrous, but the townsfolk said, listen, you've got to do this for the good of the town, because if the vampire is residing within your family cemetery, that if you don't do something about it, it's going to move on and it will kill other people. So as a good citizen, you have to do this. He basically wanted to keep the peace. He wanted to keep the peace, so he agreed to it, but he would only agree to it if they had a absolutely legit physician there. So they got a local doctor who was living in the nearby town of Wickford to go out there with them, and they exhumed the body of Mercy, her mother, and her sister. Her mother and sister had both been dead for quite some time, and when they exhumed them, they found that they were just skeletons, but Mercy's body was beautifully preserved, almost perfect. And the townsfolk who'd come to see this whole thing through said, this is proof. She's clearly the vampire. Well, the doctor said, it's March. She died in January. It's been freezing cold. Clearly, her body is preserved because it's been cold. The townsfolk said, nope. Clearly, this is the vampire. We've got to do this. So in order to keep the peace, they went through with this. They cut out Mercy's heart. They burned it to ash. And then in probably one of the most gruesome chapters in all of vampiric lore, they made a tincture, a concoction from the ashes of Mercy's heart, and gave it to her ailing brother Edwin, in the idea that it would cure him, basically like a vaccination against the vampire plague, which he was already suffering from. Mm-hmm. I'm just going to go right ahead and give you a spoiler warning. It didn't work. Edwin ended up dying just a few months later. But what's fascinating about this story is not just that it was taking place in 1892, which, just in case you're not sure about this, the Statue of Liberty already up in New York Harbor. Coca-Cola could be gotten at your local market. This is not the Dark Ages here. This was comparatively modern history. And within no time, this story caught fire. Somebody out there leaked it to the newspapers. First, the Providence Journal, then eventually the New York World ran stories about this, and it was huge. It was a scandal. And it was a scandal because in the quiet communities like Exeter, Rhode Island, where this had happened, people considered it everyday events. But in more educated areas of the country, people couldn't believe that this barbarism was still happening. And this was kind of the moment when I think people realized that this superstition still existed and was actually still flourishing in the communities of New England, even though it had begun to die out in Europe at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very fascinating. And that's really one of my favorite stories. Unfortunately, though, it had to happen to a poor girl. But again, to put things in perspective, my My great grandmother was born in 1890, and I knew her. She died in 1977. And the reason why we also know that it's so cold, and as in 1892, it was so cold for boys to play outside that the game of basketball was actually invented that winter because it was so cold. And that is why Mercy Brown's body was able to be preserved in that kind of state of being. So the doctor was indeed right. So we have, because of this weather front that was going through New England at the time, not only do we have a vampire case, but we also have the invention of basketball.
So I want to kind of jump over a couple things really quickly because I want to talk about what all this led into, which was the publication of the novel Dracula. And there's a lot of reason to suspect that the story of the New England vampires had some impact on the novel Dracula. I think it acted quite a bit. There are other researchers who think that the impact was smaller. Among them is that when the New York World ran their story about the vampire belief in New England just a couple years later, that they had not only a lot of details that would turn up in very, very similar fashion in the novel Dracula, but also quite a bit about vampire bats. And the truth is that no matter that bats had always been considered a fairly demonic part of folklore, they had never directly been associated with vampires. The idea of vampires turning into bats really hadn't been present in the lore until that time. But the extensive information on vampire bats, which were named after the folkloric vampire, not the other way around, turned up in this article. And this article exists in Bram Stoker's research notes for Dracula. So we know that Bram Stoker became aware of the New England vampires and, of course, had at least access to this much information about bats and may have incorporated them for that reason. But as I say, there are some researchers who minimize that impact. I think that it certainly is a lot of reason to think that that had quite an impact on it. But Dracula would go on to be published just 4 years after the Mercy Brown story. And there's a lot of similarity even in the story of the character in the novel Dracula of Lucy Westenra, Lucy, the young girl who ends up succumbing to Dracula's bite, being taken out of the crypt by her family, having to have her a stake driven through her heart. Her story has so many similarities to the story of Mercy Brown. I've always found it very hard to believe that there wasn't some influence there.
And Mercy and Mina, or in the middle name is Lena, and you have Mina as well too. So even the names sound similar.
And I mean, that's jumping to some conclusions, but even still, to me, it's fascinating. Nothing else, it certainly is an intriguing connection. Right. But
my friend, because we're getting and we have to cover this because your trip to England would be for naught unless we cover this. We have 7 minutes left, my friend. We have to cover your investigation into the vampires of England.
So I went to England just a couple of weeks ago now, and I went there largely in search of some information on Dracula to include in my upcoming book called Hunting Dracula, which is about my own quest to find him. But while I was in Northern England, I could not fail to visit another vampire story that I'd been fascinated by since I was a kid. And just a year before Dracula was published, a man by the name of Augustus Hare wrote a 6-volume story called The Story of My Life. But it was really a lot of collection of other stories from other people's lives, and published it in 1896, just before Dracula was published. And mostly it's anecdotes and humorous and things like that. But there are a couple little ghost stories in there. And one of them has been reprinted time and again. It's always fascinated me. And that is called The Vampire of Croglin. Now, when I read this as a teenager, I found the story terrifying. It deals with a family who rent a little house in a village called Croglin. The house they rent is called Croglin Grange. And what's unusual about Croglin Grange is that it's a single-story home. So even the bedrooms are on the first floor. And these two brothers and a sister rent this house. And one summer, while they're all relaxing, they've just gone to bed. It's a hot summer night. And the sister opens the windows to her bedroom, sits up in bed reading, trying to, get some fresh air in the room. And she sees a strange light in the distance, kind of creeping towards the window. She becomes fascinated by it until she begins to realize that it looks a lot like eyes. And when she realizes it looks like eyes, she becomes very frightened. She wants to close her window, but she doesn't want to go towards the window, draw attention to herself. So she sits in bed and she just hopes the thing goes away. Unfortunately, it does not. And within just a few minutes, the thing that she begins to realize it is a thing approaches her window and begins to climb through. She wants to scream, but she's so terrified she cannot make a sound until until the thing literally crawls through the window, grabs her by the back of the hair, drags her to the side of the bed, and bites into her throat. Now the pain releases her scream. She screams bloody murder. Her brothers burst away into the room and don't catch the thing. They see it sneaking through the window. They see it running off across the lawn towards the nearby churchyard. They pursue it, but they're not able to find it. And ultimately, the next day, they call the authorities. The authorities insist that this has to be an escaped lunatic, but because they're so distressed, the family goes off to the south of France to try to recuperate. Time goes by, and they finally decide they're going to return to Crogland. The sister, being quite a trooper about this, says, listen, lunatics don't escape every day. We've rented this house for 5 years. There's no way that we're going to give up that money. It's still a beautiful house. Let's just go back. So they do. They return. From this point on, the brothers start keeping guns under their pillows just in case. But basically, they return to their normal life. A few weeks after they get back, now the window's sensibly shut. The sister hears a scratching noise at the window, and when she looks up, she sees this thing, the same shriveled brown corpse-like thing that had crawled into her window, picking away at the lead of the glass, reaches its arm in. Now she screams. She's not frozen anymore. She screams. Her brothers burst into the room once more, guns in hand, pursue the thing out onto the lawn, and one of them manages to hit it in the leg. They can't find it that night because it's pitch black out there, but the next day they track the blood back to the churchyard. And there in the crypt of the church, they find all of the coffins have been upended, bones everywhere. Only one intact coffin remains. And that intact coffin is holding a shriveled, horrifying looking little corpse-like creature. Sensibly, they burn the corpse, they burn the coffin. The thing lets out a scream like bloody murder, and that is the end of the Crogland vampire. Now, I thought this story was absolutely fascinating when I was a kid, but it didn't take me long to realize that people had been suggesting that it was actually based on something that had really happened. And over the years following it, I always tried to learn bits and pieces about it. And some people had tried to debunk the story, and other people had tried to prove it. But one thing that we knew for sure, there really was a town called Crogland. There was a churchyard. And what had been a hard thing to find out is whether a place called Crogland Grange, the place they had rented, had ever existed. Many people insisted that there was no such building, especially no such single-story building. So I went there in the hopes of finding out the truth. I went to visit the churchyard of Crogland, which really does exist. It's just a little bit over a mile from the location that was said to be the location of this Crogland Grange. And the story so specifically mentions the single story building that people have always discounted the idea of this place called Crogland Low Hall as being the location. But Crogland Low Hall is a building that is at least 600 years old. And if you look at the building, you can clearly see, even in the brickwork of it, you can see that it has been restructured, and that the second half, the upper stories of the building, are clearly made from an entirely different brick, an entirely different strata, and that this building does actually have a history of having at one time been a single-story building. Every piece of historical data suggests that this is the real Crogland Grange, and we even have been able to prove that the Fisher family, who are specifically mentioned in Augustus Hare's story, were tenants there for an extended period of time. So does this prove that a vampire existed in Crogland? Of course it doesn't, but it proves that the story itself has a certain degree of truth to it. And to me, I think that that's just about everything. Now, I have to say that, first of all, it was a tiny little village in about as middle of nowhere as anything has ever been. But the people there do seem to take the local story with a bit of humor. In fact, one of my favorite things I saw in the town is somebody with a bat door knocker on their door in the little village. So clearly they've got a little bit of a sense of humor about it. But it's gone on to become a fairly popular story. It's actually been reinterpreted in poems and in stories. It's actually been sort of inspired a couple of different films, artwork, even a children's book called The Vampire of Crogland, which I think is delightful. Some artwork I showed a few minutes ago actually came from this children's book version of the story. So for me, it was a real lifetime joy to go and see this place. So we're coming right up on the end of it today. I would hope that tonight that we were going to be able to get into some details about the vampires in cinema. But here's the thing, folks. You've seen vampire movies. We know what's out there. We've got Dracula. We have the Lost Boys. We have all these wonderful shows over the course of the last few decades, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, True Blood. If anybody here's a fan of what we do in the shadows, you know that vampires are with us to stay. I think they're probably one of the most fascinating creatures in all of folklore, and maybe in some ways one of the ones that are closest to us, because today they represent our desire for lust and love, our desire to be attractive. They represent our fears of death and our desire for eternal life. And I don't think vampires are going away anytime soon. So I think I'm dragging this out a little bit too much, but I did want to share with you that story about my little adventure in northern England, and so we have come to the end of our show this evening. Ron, you want to tell them a little bit about your upcoming event that you've got a little bit later this year?
Yeah, it's going to be August the 13th in beautiful downtown Paris, Tennessee, where I'll be discussing the Dogman and other werewolf legends throughout North America and Europe. So come and get your tickets. They're going very, very quickly, but I would hope to see at least some of our listeners' faces there whenever I do this.
And ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to learn more about me and what I do, of course, you can always visit me at ghostboypress.com. And if you're interested, you can pre-order the deluxe hardcover edition of my upcoming book, Hunting Dracula, where I'll talk not only about the Kroglan vampire, but about my quest for Dracula, both across Transylvania and across northern England. And that's an exclusive hardcover. There's only be 100 copies published, and you will be getting a signed copy if anybody wants one of those. Obviously, I would love to set one aside for you. So, folks, as always, thank you so much for joining us. I know this was a whirlwind talk today. We're a little bit over our time, but we are always thrilled to have you guys with us, and we will see you next Monday on Monday Night. If I can get to the right button.